Most people imagine food shortages as something obvious, like completely empty store shelves. But that's not really how it plays out in reality. Before you head out on your next grocery trip, it's worth paying attention to what's actually happening. Over just the first 5 months of this year, three major forces have been building up at the same time. Food prices have been climbing, fuel and transportation costs have gone up as well, and on top of that, a series of severe weather events has been hitting key farming regions that supply a large portion of what eventually ends up in stores. So when strain builds in the system, it doesn't usually appear as totally empty shelves. Instead, it shows up more subtly, through reduced variety, gradual price increases that are easy to overlook, and eventually in what ends up on your plate at home. Not as obvious hunger, but something much quieter and harder to notice at first. There are 12 items involved here: what they do, why most people tend to ignore them, and why waiting until June might be a mistake. Number 10 is especially surprising and often catches people completely off guard. Keep that in mind as we go through them. Let's dive in. Number 12 is dried mushrooms. This is one of those pantry items that almost never gets mentioned when people talk about long-term food storage, yet it quietly makes a big difference in how meals actually feel. Picture this. The pantry is fully stocked. You've got rice, pasta, canned foods, beans, everything you need on paper. Nothing is missing, nothing has run out. And still, somewhere around the third or fourth week, something subtle starts to fall apart. Meals don't feel satisfying anymore. People begin eating less, not because food is unavailable, but because they're simply no longer interested in what's there. Plates come back half-finished, dinners get skipped, and strangely enough, the pantry is still full while the problem keeps growing. This has nothing to do with calories or even protein. It's about flavor fatigue. And that's exactly where dried mushrooms come in. They're one of the most powerful natural sources of umami you can find in a regular grocery store at almost any price point. Umami is often called the fifth taste. It's that deep, savory richness you recognize in a slow-simmered broth or a long-cooked stew. It's the element that makes a meal feel complete instead of just edible. Even a small handful of dried mushrooms, soaked in warm water until they soften, can completely transform something basic like plain noodles or a simple soup. Toss them into stews, grains, or sauces, and suddenly the dish feels much richer and more satisfying than the ingredients would suggest on their own. There's also a small detail most people overlook. Don't throw away the soaking liquid. It's packed with flavor and essentially works like an instant mushroom broth. Using it as part of your cooking base instantly upgrades whatever you're making. From a nutrition standpoint, dried mushrooms bring fiber, B vitamins, potassium, selenium, and copper. One bag can last for weeks because you only need a little at a time. They're lightweight, compact, shelf-stable, and don't require refrigeration or electricity. As summer temperatures rise and fresh ingredients spoil faster, these kinds of shelf-stable flavor boosters start to matter more than they seem to on a normal shopping day. Dried mushrooms won't be the thing that keeps you fed on their own, but they might be the thing that keeps your meals enjoyable enough that you actually want to eat them. Number 11 is salt. If you were to ask a historian, not a nutritionist, not a chef, but someone who studies how societies actually developed, which single commodity has influenced trade routes the most, sparked conflicts, and even decided which communities managed to survive hard times, the answer might surprise you. It wouldn't be wheat, rice, or livestock. It would be salt. Salt is so inexpensive, so widely available, and so ordinary today that its true importance has basically faded into the background. It's something people pass in the kitchen without a second thought. But that casual attitude is exactly where the misunderstanding begins. Salt actually plays two major roles, though most people only focus on one. The first is flavor. Salt doesn't just make food salty, it transforms it. It enhances every other taste in a dish, cuts through bitterness, highlights sweetness, and brings everything into sharper balance. Without enough salt, food doesn't just taste a bit dull. It can feel oddly flat and unappealing, to the point where it naturally reduces appetite without people even realizing it. The second role is far more important historically: preservation. Long before refrigerators or canned goods existed, salt was one of the main tools humans used to keep food from spoiling. By salting, curing, pickling, or brining, people could store meat, fish, and vegetables for much longer periods. The science behind it is simple but powerful. Salt pulls moisture out of food and creates an environment where bacteria and spoilage can't easily survive. That principle still works today exactly as it did thousands of years ago. From a nutritional point of view, salt provides sodium, which is essential for maintaining fluid balance in the body, supporting nerve signals, and enabling proper muscle function. When it's iodized, it also supplies iodine, a key nutrient for thyroid health that can become harder to get when diets are limited or restricted. What really sets salt apart from almost everything else in your pantry is its storage ability. If kept dry and sealed away from moisture, salt doesn't expire. It doesn't oxidize, it doesn't break down, and it doesn't lose its usefulness. A properly stored container can remain just as effective decades later, something almost no other everyday food can claim. Salt isn't included on this list because it's rare or hard to find. It's here for the opposite reason, because it's so common that most people never think about protecting their supply. And that, in itself, is the real risk. Number 10 is whole spices. There's a woman named Carol living in rural Ohio who has kept a detailed kitchen journal for years, tracking recipes, household spending, and what meals worked well or didn't. When her family's income dropped significantly, she eventually went back through those notes to understand what had actually changed in their daily life. What she discovered surprised her. She hadn't written about running out of food at any point. Instead, she kept describing something more subtle. She had started to dread making dinner. Her pantry never actually went empty, but after about 2 weeks into tighter circumstances, the pattern in her notes shifted. The same meals kept appearing over and over. Same as yesterday. Nobody wanted seconds anymore. Her teenage son started finding excuses to eat elsewhere, and her husband gradually stopped sitting down at the table altogether, often just grabbing something simple like crackers while standing in the kitchen. No one was technically going hungry, but something important had clearly changed. When she looked closer, she realized the problem wasn't the amount of food she had. It was that everything had started to taste the same. Over time, her spice collection had quietly dwindled, and what was left had mostly lost its strength. A few containers were still sitting there, but they'd been open so long that the contents had become dull and almost lifeless in terms of flavor. That's the real role of whole spices, and it's something most people don't fully appreciate until it's missing. They don't contribute calories, protein, or fat. What they do instead is far more psychological. They give meals variety and keep the brain interested in eating. The same basic pot of beans, for example, can feel like completely different dishes depending on how it's seasoned. Over time, when cooking becomes repetitive and constrained, that difference becomes everything, between food people look forward to and food they simply tolerate. A few black peppercorns alone can completely change the character of a soup. A cinnamon stick can turn plain oatmeal from something routine into something comforting and enjoyable. Toasted cumin seeds added to oil before cooking beans bring out a warmth and nuttiness that simply isn't there otherwise. Even cloves in a slow-cooked stew add a depth that salt on its own can't replace. Number 8 is honey. There's a certain type of fatigue that isn't really about sleep. It shows up even when you've rested enough, and it comes from something more subtle. Your body is getting calories, but not in a form that it can convert into quick, usable energy. Slow-digesting foods like proteins and complex carbohydrates can keep you going, but they don't always support steady focus or motivation over a long, demanding day, whether that demand is physical or mental. By the time afternoon arrives, even simple tasks can start to feel heavier than they should. It's not a dramatic crash, but it builds gradually in the background. Honey has been used for exactly this kind of gap in energy for thousands of years. From ancient Egypt to medieval Europe to parts of Southeast Asia, very different cultures arrived at the same simple solution. The reason is straightforward. Honey is made up mostly of natural sugars that the body can absorb and use quickly without much digestion. It delivers fast, accessible energy with minimal effort. But its value goes beyond just energy. Pure honey, when properly sealed, doesn't spoil in the normal sense. It isn't just a claim, it's been proven historically. Archaeologists have discovered jars of honey in ancient tombs that are thousands of years old and still chemically stable. Its low moisture content, natural acidity, and antimicrobial properties make it one of the most shelf-stable foods that exist in a typical kitchen. In a world where most foods rely on refrigeration or constant restocking, that kind of stability is significant. Honey is also extremely versatile. A single jar can sweeten tea or coffee, improve oatmeal, balance the acidity in sauces, work in baking, or even provide a quick direct energy boost on its own. Over time, it naturally becomes something you reach for across many different meals. There are a couple of practical things worth knowing before buying it. First, crystallization is completely normal. When honey becomes thick or grainy, it hasn't gone bad. It's just the natural sugars solidifying. Gently warming the container brings it back to a smooth liquid state. Throwing it away at that point is simply a waste. Second, it's important to check the label carefully. A lot of products marketed as honey are actually mostly glucose syrup or corn syrup, with only a small amount of real honey mixed in. Taking a few seconds to read the ingredients can make a big difference. As warmer months increase demand and transportation costs continue to rise, honey prices often climb before most people even notice the trend. And more often than not, the regret comes later from the people who had the chance to buy an extra jar and didn't. If this has been useful so far, a quick like helps others find it before they run into the same issues. Let's continue. Number 7 is canned coconut milk. This is one of those items that tends to surprise people the most, so it's worth paying attention to. There's a story about a retired school teacher named Margaret who made what seemed like a very sensible decision. In order to cut back on her grocery spending, she simplified her pantry to the basics: rice, dried lentils, canned beans, pasta, cheap, filling staples with long shelf lives. On paper, everything looked perfectly balanced. The math made sense. But what she didn't anticipate was how those meals would actually feel after a few weeks. Around the 3-week mark, something subtle started to shift. She would finish a full bowl of food and still feel oddly unsatisfied. It wasn't real hunger in the traditional sense, but more like a lack of completion. Her energy felt inconsistent, and she noticed herself thinking about food far more often than her intake would suggest. When she went back to check everything, the numbers still looked fine. Calories were there, protein was there. But there was a key element missing that didn't show up on her tracking sheet: fat. Dietary fat is one of the most overlooked parts of long-term food planning. It's what gives meals richness and satiety, the sense that you've actually finished eating rather than just stopped consuming calories. It also plays a critical role in helping the body absorb fat-soluble vitamins like A, D, E, and K from other foods. Without enough fat, those nutrients can pass through the system without being fully used, no matter how nutritious the meal appears on paper. Fat is also what turns eating from something purely functional into something satisfying and sensory. Without it, a pantry full of dry, low-fat staples can look complete in theory, but feel strangely empty in practice. Canned coconut milk fills that gap in a way very few shelf-stable foods can. Even a single can added to rice, beans, or a simple vegetable stew can completely change the result, adding creaminess, depth, and richness that water and dry ingredients alone can't replicate. It transforms the overall texture of a meal, making it feel more substantial and complete. From a nutritional perspective, coconut milk contains natural saturated fats along with minerals like manganese, copper, and iron. In most cases, full-fat versions are far more useful than reduced-fat ones, since the low-fat alternatives often replace the missing fat with additives or thickeners that don't provide the same effect. One common mistake is assuming coconut milk only belongs in specific cuisines like Thai or Indian cooking. In reality, its usefulness in a simple pantry has nothing to do with tradition. It's about improving whatever you're already eating. And in situations where meals start to feel flat or incomplete despite having enough food, this is very often the missing piece. Number 6 is cooking oil. Let's slow this down and really look at what's going on here. Imagine you had to cut your household food supply in half tomorrow, and your only objective was to keep your energy and mental performance stable for as long as possible. What would you prioritize keeping? Most people immediately think of protein sources: meat, beans, eggs, followed by carbohydrates like rice, pasta, or bread. Very few people would naturally choose oil. But that blind spot is more important than it seems. Grammatically speaking, cooking oil is one of the most energy-dense foods in any kitchen. Just a single tablespoon can contain more usable calories than a full cup of many vegetables. Because of this, fats have historically been treated as valuable, carefully preserved resources in nearly every culture and climate around the world. Different regions simply used what was available: olive oil in Mediterranean countries, rendered animal fats in colder northern climates, coconut oil in tropical areas. The form changed depending on geography, but the importance of fat itself never did. Without adequate fat, even a well-stocked pantry begins to fall short in a very real way. Beyond just calories, fat plays a key role in sustaining energy over longer periods compared to simple carbohydrates. It also creates satiety, that feeling that a meal has actually been enough. On top of that, fat is essential for absorbing fat-soluble vitamins like A, D, E, and K. Without it, those nutrients pass through the body with limited benefit, even if the food containing them is plentiful. For example, a simple bowl of rice becomes far more complete and satisfying when a bit of oil is added, not just in taste, but in nutritional value as well. Cooking oil isn't limited to frying. It can be stirred into soups to add richness, drizzled over grains or vegetables to improve texture and flavor, used as a base for sauces, or even incorporated into baked dishes. It often doesn't stand out in a recipe, but its absence is immediately noticeable once it's gone. On the practical side, cooking oil prices are closely tied to agricultural conditions, things like sunflower, olive, canola, soybean, and palm crop yields. Droughts, heat waves, and supply chain disruptions in key producing regions can push prices upward quickly, and this has already been seen multiple times in recent years. One of the most common mistakes people make is waiting until they're almost out before replacing it. That removes any flexibility when prices shift. Simply keeping one extra bottle on hand when prices are stable is one of the easiest ways to protect a household budget. Most cooking oils, when stored properly in a cool, dry place away from light, can stay usable for a year or even longer. Number 5 is canned tomatoes. Canned tomatoes rarely get recognized for what they really contribute in a kitchen. They're not a protein source, they're not a carbohydrate, and nobody usually points to them as the main ingredient of a meal. They tend to sit in the background, almost invisible in the final dish. But the interesting thing is this. If you remove them, a lot of recipes suddenly stop working properly. What canned tomatoes actually bring is structural support for cooking. They deliver 3 key elements at the same time: a liquid base that helps everything cook together, natural acidity that brightens and balances all the other flavors in the pot, and a kind of body that helps separate ingredients come together into something cohesive rather than random pieces floating in liquid. That combination is what transforms loose ingredients into an actual dish. Think about it in real terms. If you take white beans, half an onion, some frozen corn, a bit of leftover sausage, and maybe a handful of dry pasta, and just boil them in water, you don't really end up with a meal. You end up with ingredients sitting in a broth. Now add a single can of crushed tomatoes, and the entire thing changes. It becomes a stew. The acidity sharpens the flavors, the texture of the tomatoes gives the liquid weight, and even the color and aroma suddenly make it feel like real food instead of a random mix of items. That shift, from stuff in a pot to something recognizable and satisfying, is exactly what 1 can of tomatoes does. From a nutritional standpoint, canned tomatoes provide vitamin C, potassium, and lycopene. Lycopene is particularly interesting because it's one of those rare cases where processing actually improves the nutrient. The heat used during canning makes lycopene more bioavailable than it is in a raw tomato, meaning your body can absorb it more easily. On top of that, canned tomatoes are usually among the most affordable items in any grocery store. They also store well for long periods and come in several formats: whole, diced, crushed, or pured, each useful depending on what you're cooking. A common mistake is treating them as something you only buy when a recipe specifically calls for them. That mindset turns them into a specialty ingredient. In reality, canned tomatoes are one of the most versatile and functional staples you can keep in a pantry, the kind of item that quietly improves almost everything else you cook. Number 4 is egg powder. Some shortages don't show up in an obvious, dramatic way. They don't start with empty shelves or clear warnings. More often, they begin as a small inconvenience, just a slightly higher price than expected, or a carton of eggs you buy without really paying attention to the cost. Then, slowly, something shifts. As you mentally go through the meals you normally cook, you start realizing one by one that many of them don't really work without eggs. What first felt like a minor annoyance gradually turns into something harder to ignore. There's a good example of this from a bakery owner in Vermont named James, who carefully tracked his ingredient costs during a period of rising egg prices. What his records showed wasn't just a simple price increase, it was a chain reaction. Eggs turned out to be a structural ingredient in nearly a third of everything he made. They weren't just part of egg-based dishes. They held recipes together, added texture, contributed richness, and played a role in both structure and consistency across a wide range of baked goods. When the price of eggs doubled and kept rising, it didn't just affect a few menu items, it impacted almost his entire operation. That's the part most people don't fully notice until eggs become unreliable. Eggs aren't just a breakfast food. They act as a binder in baking, a leavening support in cakes and muffins, an emulsifier in sauces, and a key source of protein in countless dishes that don't obviously look like egg dishes at all. Their importance often only becomes clear when they're suddenly not there. Egg powder is designed to solve that problem. It's made by cooking whole eggs, turning them into a liquid, and then dehydrating them into a shelf-stable powder. When mixed with water in the correct ratio, it can be reconstituted into something that behaves much like beaten eggs, making it usable in scrambled eggs, pancakes, breads, pasta, pastries, and batters. There is one important limitation to be honest about. Egg powder can't really recreate the texture of a fried or softly boiled egg. That specific experience doesn't translate well. But for the functional roles eggs play in cooking, binding, enriching, helping dough rise, and adding protein, it can replicate much of that utility. From a nutritional perspective, egg powder still contains the full protein profile of fresh eggs, along with fats, fat-soluble vitamins, and essential minerals. It's not just a substitute, it's a genuinely useful ingredient in its own right. In terms of storage, properly packaged egg powder lasts far longer than fresh eggs, which require refrigeration, are fragile, and have a relatively short usable life. And in many ways, the best time to think about adding it to your pantry is when it feels least necessary, when you already have eggs in the fridge and everything seems normal. Because once prices spike or supply becomes unstable, the decision is no longer really in your hands. Number 3 is whole wheat berries. Most of what people buy in modern grocery stores is already in its final form. Bread comes pre-baked, pasta is already shaped and dried, flour is pre-milled, and cereals are fully processed, packaged, and ready to eat. That's how today's food system is designed: streamlined, convenient, and efficient when everything is functioning normally. But there's a hidden weakness in that system that usually goes unnoticed until conditions start to shift. When finished products become more expensive, less available, or more limited in variety, your choices shrink quickly. You're left selecting only from what's already on the shelf, with no real ability to adapt or create alternatives on your own. Whole wheat berries change that dynamic at a basic level. A wheat berry is the entire grain kernel in its original form, the complete seed of the wheat plant before it goes through any milling or refining. Because it's unprocessed, it isn't locked into a single use. Instead, it can be transformed into several different foods depending on what you need at the moment. If you grind it, it becomes whole wheat flour, which can be used for bread, pasta, pastries, or flatbreads. If you cook it as is, it turns into a dense, chewy grain that works well as a side dish or as a base for porridge, similar in some ways to rice. If you soak and sprout it, you get fresh wheat sprouts with living nutrients that no shelf-stable processed product can really replicate. So one ingredient can effectively serve multiple roles: flour, grain, or sprouts, all from the same purchase. From a storage perspective, whole wheat berries are remarkably stable. When kept dry and sealed in airtight containers, they can maintain their quality for many years, even decades. That's because the germ and bran, the parts of the grain that contain most of its natural oils, stay protected as long as they aren't exposed to moisture or air. Once the grain is milled into flour, those oils are exposed and begin to oxidize, which is why whole grain flour typically only lasts a few months. In contrast, the intact berry can be stored for years without significant loss of quality. Nutritionally, whole wheat berries provide complex carbohydrates, dietary fiber, plant-based protein, B vitamins, and a range of minerals. In many ways, it's a more complete food than refined grain products, which lose a significant portion of their natural nutrients during processing. Number 2 is canned sardines. There's a certain kind of reassurance that comes from knowing that no matter what's happening at the store, no matter what's in stock or what's missing, when you open this, it will be exactly as expected. No uncertainty, no spoilage checks, no surprises. You simply open the can and the food is there. That kind of reliability doesn't feel especially important when fresh food is cheap, abundant, and predictable. But the moment that changes, even slightly, a pantry item that delivers complete consistency suddenly becomes far more valuable than it initially appears on the shelf. Canned sardines fit that role perfectly, and their nutritional profile is stronger than many people assume. They provide a complete source of protein, containing all essential amino acids in a single serving. They also offer a meaningful amount of omega-3 fatty acids, which support heart health, help reduce inflammation, and play a role in cognitive function. They're also one of the more reliable natural sources of vitamin D, which is difficult to obtain from most non-fortified foods and is commonly lacking in a large portion of the population. Then there's calcium, which is often overlooked. Sardines are usually eaten with their small, softened bones intact. These bones become edible during the canning process and provide a highly bioavailable source of calcium, often more per serving than many foods typically associated with bone health. So in one can, you're getting protein, omega-3s, vitamin D, and calcium all at once, with no refrigeration and no preparation required. The shelf life can extend for years, making them one of the more practical long-term pantry staples available. From a cooking perspective, they're also more versatile than their reputation suggests. They can be eaten straight from the can with nothing added, mixed into rice or pasta for a quick complete meal, spread onto bread or crackers with a bit of mustard or lemon, or incorporated into tomato-based sauces where they melt in and add depth without an overpowering fish taste. In terms of selection, sardines packed in olive oil or water tend to offer the most flexibility depending on how you plan to use them. A simple but important practical note: it's worth inspecting the can before use. Damage along the seams can compromise the seal, and any bulging or swelling is a clear sign that it should not be opened. One of the biggest mistakes people make with sardines is treating them as an occasional on-sale purchase. In reality, their real value comes from consistency, keeping them as a permanent, dependable part of the pantry, always available, always ready, and always exactly what you expect. Number 1 is instant potato flakes. When people think about building a reliable pantry, they usually picture a version of themselves who is calm, organized, and able to cook proper meals from a well-stocked kitchen without stress or time pressure. That version of you absolutely exists, but it's not the only one that matters. There will inevitably be days when that ideal situation doesn't match reality. Days when you've already spent hours doing physically exhausting work and have almost nothing left in the tank. Days when someone at home is sick and your attention has been pulled in every direction. Days when extreme heat makes standing over a stove feel genuinely uncomfortable. Or days when mental and emotional fatigue are so high that even simple cooking feels like too much. On those days, the question isn't what a perfect meal would look like. It becomes something much simpler. What can you realistically make in the next 10 minutes with whatever energy you still have? Instant potato flakes are essentially a direct answer to that question. The process is already done for you. Potatoes are cooked, mashed, and dehydrated before they ever reach the shelf. Your only job is to add hot water and stir. In just a few minutes, you get warm, soft mashed potatoes that are comforting, easy to eat, and require almost no effort at exactly the moment when effort is in short supply. But their usefulness doesn't stop at convenience. Instant potato flakes also work as a highly practical thickening agent. Stir them into a thin soup and they immediately add body and substance without significantly changing the flavor. Mix them into sauces and they can create a similar effect to a roux, but without the extra cooking time or risk of clumping. Add them to bread dough or meat mixtures, and they improve texture in a noticeable and consistent way in the final result. This is exactly why they show up in commercial kitchens, on ships, and in large-scale food service operations, not as a backup option, but as a deliberate functional ingredient. Nutritionally, they mainly provide fast-digesting carbohydrates and a small amount of potassium. They are not a significant protein source, and that isn't really the point. The value here is quick energy and an easy warm meal on days when anything more complicated simply isn't realistic. One container can provide multiple servings at a very low cost per portion, with no refrigeration needed and minimal storage space required.